Welcome to today's webinar, The Future of Recruiting, the top 3 trends from the 2016 Recruiter Nation study. My name is Claire Alloway. I'm here from the marketing team here at Jobvite. I'm just going to go over some introductions before we get started. One note that I know I'll get questions on is, yes, you will be receiving the slides after the webinar along with a full recording. So first up, here are today's speakers. So we have Rachel Biddy, who is our Chief People Officer here at Jobvite. She'll be moderating and sharing some key statistics from the survey. We also have Dan Finnegan, our CEO here at Jobvite, and Chris Dunn, the founder of Fistful of Talent and the CHRO at Kinetics. You can see all of their Twitter handles at the bottom, so feel free to tweet them during the webinar. But we'd actually love for you to join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag JZChat. You can also use our handle at Jobvite. And we'll be following along there on Twitter and answering any questions you have there. So to get started, I'm going to pass it over to Rachel for our first topic.
Great. Thank you, Claire. Welcome, everyone. We're thrilled to have you joining us today. We really do have 2 experts in the space of talent acquisition who I know both just came off of a trip to Chicago for HR Tech last week, so fresh ideas and perspectives from our customers and prospects and analysts and other leaders in the industry. So we're thrilled to have that joined with the Jobvite Recruiter Nation study that we also have as well. We're going to kick off right away into our first theme, which is all around live or die by your candidate experience. This is really no longer becoming optional for customers. In fact, it's becoming super critical as we look at the world of transparency and candidates getting insights into companies, just as companies have always gotten insights about candidates as part of the interview process, but that really being a two-way street in understanding each other and looking for matches. The thing that we'd love to share is that there's so much about this space. Dan was coming off a bunch of analyst meetings last week with HR Tech, and the analysts really wanted to talk a lot about the talent pool and that experience that they're having through the hiring process. Also a lot about collaborative hiring, right? It's no longer just a relationship between a recruiter and a hiring manager and a candidate, but their collaboration across the different social medias that are out there, also the rest of the interview team and the rest of the company. And then another overarching theme that he really heard was around predictive analytics. And so for heads of talent acquisition and HR leaders, really thinking about how do you use data and information to get predictive in the work that you do. And I know that Chris has worked with a lot of companies and so has a very broad perspective in looking at companies and how they think about metrics and data in this space. So we'll jump right in. Stat number 1, 69% of all job seekers would not take a job with a company that had a bad reputation, even if they were unemployed. So that tells you something about candidates continuing to be particular about their choices that they take and having options in what they're wanting to do. It is still very competitive for the best candidates. The data showed us that again. But at the same time, candidates are having a lot more information about companies before. And what's interesting is that they're actually doing a lot of their homework and they're actually having a perspective on a company before they even really engage with that company, whether it's out there on social media sites or just information about an employment brand. They actually are doing homework even before they're having even phone interviews with recruiters. The other thing we noticed too is that 59% of candidates say they've actually searched on social media. So they're actually telling us that that's the case. And that came from our Job Seeker Nation done earlier this year. So that just tells you a lot about reputation and brand really kind of plays into this candidate experience. We asked specifically recruiters, do they anticipate the job market will continue to be competitive? And you can see here from 2003, 14, 15, and 16, it's still really high at that 95%. And candidates are still really in the driver's seat. They're the ones that are really asking and demanding that experience be fantastic. They're wanting information and to have communication. They're also wanting transparency and something that's really vital to that entire hiring plan and process. But there's also something around authenticity that is really continuing to emerge in this world of transparency. The other interesting statistic that we noticed in the recruiter survey too was that the recruiters, 58% of recruiters are saying that candidates are just much more confident in even negotiating And so as a staffing organization, having a recruiting team that really is comfortable with that and being able to do that and really recognizing that candidates are negotiating as part of that supply and demand that's so prevalent. So that's kind of our first aim. What I'd love to reach out with Chris and Dan is really kind of ask them a couple questions. I mean, these are folks who really have a tremendous amount of insights in the industry, also just hot off of doing lots of connections with HR Tech last week. So, Dan, I'd love to start with you. Why do you think companies are still not really concentrating on the candidate experience in the way that they need to be?
It's a good question. I was just Monday on the East Coast with a very large enterprise company in the automotive space. And before, as I usually do, before talking about Jobvite and the like, I just asked them, what are they dealing with? And they had people representing all their subsidiaries from Canada and Mexico and across the country, people who run warehouses and driver services as well as retail operations. And across the board, I detected a strong anxiety around and almost an immediate recognition that, and the words they used were candidate experience. They were using the words candidate experience, not us. That they're very concerned that they have a horrible candidate experience that they've had for a long, long time. This is a company that started in the 20s. It's quite big. It's not necessarily a fast-growing, sexy company, but it's one now that they say they're really struggling finding enough warehouse people, enough drivers, as well as, of course, the traditional white-collar work in marketing and finance and the like. And so why have they not been focusing on it? I feel like this has become a perfect storm for folks in recruiting. Number one, you just kind of walk through some numbers that prove it, that the supply and demand for labor right now has never been tighter. The unemployment rate, I've been in this space since 1995 in online recruiting of some form, and I've never seen the supply and demand of labor as tight as it is in any educational socioeconomic status group. So that's one thing that's just a reality. That puts the power in the hands of those who are looking for work or would be open to new work. Second thing, where I think most people now are quite aware that people don't stay at jobs as long as they used to anymore. The most recent recessions, the last two recessions, had a dramatic increase in the number of layoffs previous to any recessions in our past. And what that did was sever any kind of confidence that employees have that a single company is going to provide them a career path. So they feel like they have to create their own career path. And so they are always looking. Another reason they're always looking is because they can. That's what's happened with the introduction of online recruiting and job boards and now professional networks like LinkedIn, and then ultimately the mobile telephone, which makes accessibility so high. They can, during a break, a walk outside to get a drink of water, they can check their phone quickly. And then finally, I would call it the glass door effect, and you've already alluded to it. In a world of social media, you can't be a restaurant that doesn't care about Yelp reviews, or you'll do terribly. Right. Well, you can't be now a company. And in fact, on Monday, several of the people brought up the fact that people were complaining about interviewing for jobs at these companies on Glassdoor. And so I think that all those things create a kind of perfect storm that creates the need to pay attention to candidate experience. And I think to really specifically answer your question, why are they not concentrating on it? I think they are. I think that it's difficult. And I think, when you start talking to people in human resources and recruiting about building a brand that is attractive to job seekers and building a candidate experience that is wonderful, similarly to the head of marketing at Apple and thinking about their brand and their customer experience, I think it's difficult. And I think recruiting departments never have a surplus of labor. They themselves see very tight budgets and are having to work double hard in this market right now. And so they really, A, don't have the time, and B, and in some cases, I think there's a new expertise that they need to bring in to their function. On Monday, and I also 2 weeks ago with another company, I suggested, because both these companies have strong consumer brands, I suggested that they go talk to the people in the marketing department and ask for help. And because they probably have more resources than the HR department has, and they probably have some expertise that recruiting doesn't have, and I think they probably have some empathy as well,
right,
because they're employees. So that's how I see it.
Right. No, I think it's a great call out with regards to, you talk about accessibility, and we talk about, you can look at something on your phone, but you can also just actually apply for a job on your mobile device now. I mean, things have gotten so fast in that technology space. I think it's great to get the perspective on all the different perfect storms and like what's making it difficult for folks. Chris, I'd love to hear, you work with tons of other, companies in lots of different industries, and you see this perspective. Is there other things that you are seeing that is making it difficult for companies to concentrate on this, and or maybe why it's difficult, and how folks can think about overcoming that hurdle?
Yeah, well, I appreciate the question. I think I agree with Dan. First of all, there is a perfect storm. You look at, the chart that said 95% of recruiters, think it's like extremely competitive. I forget exactly how it was framed, but if you look at that, that's just, and you look at the trailing factor, 2013, 2014, you see it coming up. So we're obviously at peak economic cycle. And then Dan really alluded to, the way I always frame it is, we are in a review economy now, right? And the old days of Glassdoor and some of the different sites that are out there from an employee rating perspective, the old days, it was people who got termed and they went there to rant. But what happened, Dan mentioned restaurants, and what's happened over time with the emergence of the smartphone and the fact that, a wider range of employees is now willing to rate, and it's both employees and candidates, but those people now do reviews as part of their normal life. So certainly Glassdoor and sites that are like that are based on company reputation, have a much deeper penetration rate, and the feedback on those sites has never been more balanced. So it's this mix of good and bad. So they clearly get more attention and are really perceived as being credible to a much greater degree than they've ever been. Then you've got peak economic cycle. And when you turn that around, Rachel and Dan, what we see is that candidate experience is really broken down into three parts. And companies are doing the right thing because we're at peak economic cycle. They're feeling the pain. They've got this reputation thing that maybe they didn't have to deal with in the past. So now they're saying, well, candidate experience is one of those things that we need to turn the corner on. And what they're finding is all of it's difficult to turn your culture from being a company that didn't care about candidate experience to turning it into one that values that and wants to create a very positive candidate experience. There's basically three areas that we see. The first is some of the things that are driven by technology. So when you think about solutions like Jobvite, those are great ways to automate some of your processes and to really do it with a sense of authenticity and transparency and personality. I think Jobvite delivers that better than most solutions do with our view of the industry. And I think you can automate some things to make sure that you don't drop the ball on some things that should be happening. Acknowledge receipt of a resume, doing a better job of enabling recruiters and managers to tell candidates where you are in the process. That's very, very important. Companies are turning their attention to that. But one of the things that's harder to change is once you get in that interview process, what actually goes on. I think it's very hard to train managers in your company to really sell the company and to understand that in peak economic cycle that they're no longer in a position of power, and an interview has to not only be about determining whether the candidate's the best fit for the job, and whether they want to make an offer, but they've also got to pretty quickly be in sales mode to that candidate who now, based on peak economic cycle and the fact that maybe your company reputation ratings aren't as good as they should be, that hiring manager's got to make them believe that that's a place that they actually want to work. So I think, when you think about like the automation of some of the things that create a positive candidate experience, that's one thing. Jobvite does a great job of helping people with that, but there's still this big void in terms of what happens once you deliver a candidate to the hiring manager. And I think that's the place where if we look 2, 3, 5 years into the future, companies like the one Dan mentioned, like Jobvite's going to be able to give them some great help initially, but it's a battleship they have to turn that's going to take time. It's kind of my thoughts, Rachel.
Right.
I think it's funny you say that because I think that is exactly right. I said almost verbatim on Monday, I said you have to take it one step at a time, and you have to break it down into steps. And maybe one way to do it is to think through literally the journey that a candidate has with your company and take it one step of the journey at a time, because that's what a marketing person does. They look at the customer's journey.
Right.
And the other thing you said was about hiring managers, for example. We have, and not to advertise the fact, but we have this mobile app that is focused only on hiring managers, not on recruiters. And people ask us, why didn't you create a mobile app for recruiters? And we said, well, first of all, number one, you're in Jobvite every minute of every day doing a lot of work. Second, it's hiring managers doing what they said they were going to do, showing up on time and asking the right questions and filling out a candidate evaluation. Candidates cannot stand it if their perception is that a hiring manager, because they drove all the way to the building for this interview. If the hiring manager is late, if a hiring manager just seems to sit down and go, okay, so tell me about, they don't even know what they're going to ask them. And so the hiring manager app was a way to have the recruiting department organize a hiring manager's day so they do show up on time. They do ask the right questions. They do fill out the interview evaluation. And then the final thing I'll say is what I'm calling this Glassdoor effect in this social world. It's the ultimate feedback loop that's going to help recruiting, and here's why. CEOs now are rated on Glassdoor. They will care, and they're going to increasingly care. And Glassdoor has debated internally for years if and when they should have a manager rating, like individual managers, like the VPs or the directors. And I think that's an inevitability. And once that starts to happen, you're really going to have a feedback loop that is going to grab the attention of senior management, and that probably will then lead to senior management providing human resources and recruiting more resources to do the job right.
I think you guys are on to a lot of great themes around why do companies struggle with doing this. I know we had a question on a webinar we did a week or so ago that some folks were even struggling with, how do I get my leadership to even understand that transparency is really important and that this is caught up. And so I think we see lots of data that can help make that burning platform. I know a large company I worked with previously, we literally turned it on the dime and said, guess what, that candidate could actually be a customer because we had consumer products. And it was a switch that happened for hiring managers. Oh, crap, you're right. They could actually go buy our consumer products. And so, for those of you who are in the consumer space, that's a great one to try to leverage, right? But I do think that beyond that, it is that word of mouth that is so prevalent. It's happening today about managers, right? People call each other hey, I think you might know this leader. I'm thinking about going to interview there. So it's just a matter of time before that gets on there.
It's a cultural change. I can say 30 years ago, the culture was more, hey, it's your boss, do what they say. And yesterday, the CEO of Wells Fargo, he's out.
Oh.
And I think that the half-life of senior management is shortening, and it's because there is much more transparency in our culture, let alone in the job market.
Thank you guys for both of your comments on this, and your expertise is fantastic. Anything else you just add on candidate experience before we move on to our next theme?
No, I think I'm good.
Great. So our next theme is around post-hire metrics are really gaining momentum. And I know that, when I started as a recruiter 15 years ago, my metrics were all not post-hire, and how that really is transforming. And so we saw this data come through. So 61% of recruiters are actually naming post-hire metrics as most important to measure, which is really kind of an interesting statistic. Let's actually show you what they started to talk about. So this year, performance of the hire was 37%, which is fantastic. Last year, that was actually up there as well, but it's over a 10-point lift from last year. Retention rate of talent wasn't even in our top 7 or 8 last year, and it's number 2 this year. So it went from kind of nowhere on this graph last year to number 2. Of course, time to fill has been, I think last year it was 14%, this year it's 13%, so it's still kind of correlated and tied in that arena. But I think what was staggering to us is that performance of hire jumped more than 10 points in a year, and then the retention of that talent wasn't even on this scale last year, and it's number 2 at 24%. So I think the interesting part, we start to ask ourselves, are you all, even me here at Jobvite, are we measuring this? And then how are you doing against some of those measurements? And then I'm going, great, now you have a picture potentially of how you're doing, but then how are you doing similar to other companies or industries or in your region, right? Because then it starts to go, well, what should my goals be in comparison? I think that gets into a lot of the analytics data that can be really helpful as a TA leader and as a recruiter, and kind of what do you want to be doing to improve in that whole candidate experience. So we'd love to have you guys interactive. Welcome to Interactivity. The poll we have is that recruiters should be measured on a new hire's performance up to how many days? Is it 0? Once they've signed the offer letter, it's done? 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, 6 months, or a year? So we'd love to really hear from you guys on what this should be. And we'll let you guys kind of start to chime in on all of that. I'm going to jump into some Q&A with Dan and Chris, but we're going to come back and see what those results start to tell us. So tell us what you guys think that recruiters should be kind of be looking to be measured on from a post-hire perspective. So great. With that, in this arena, what do you guys Chris, I'll start with you first. What do you think the answer on this will be? You have a ton of industry experience in lots of different companies that you get a chance to work with. What do you think it will be? And then we'll go to the results and we'll ask you whether you agree or disagree with them. How's that?
Yeah, well, I was a little surprised to see, just the quality, the quality things kind of bubble up to the top on that poll question, or the question on the Jobvite survey, mainly because it's so difficult to measure. So I think we're all we all keep an eye towards cost per hire. We all keep an eye towards time to fill, because candidly, if you don't keep your eye on that, and if you don't manage that as a recruiting or a talent acquisition leader, that's one of the things that can put you in your functional area in a lot of jeopardy if you're not filling jobs in a timely fashion. So
right.
to see those two things go down, and performance of the new hire and retention of the new hire go up, was a little surprising to me. And the best way to say this, and I'm going to throw it to Dan, the best way that I can describe why I'm surprised by that is because from a total talent management perspective, I understand once you get out of production positions, once you get out of sales positions, I kind of understand how difficult getting quality performance data is. So I almost think that's more of a wish. I think it's more recruiters telling us what they wish it was and what they'd like it to be, because candidly, most of our companies have performance data that at the most you could go thumbs up, thumbs down in terms of the performance of a new hire. It's not like it's going to be based on solid metrics. It's still going to be very qualitative. And Dan, I know you've got some thoughts on this, so I'll throw it to you, and then maybe I'll come back in after you comment.
Can I pop in just to share the results that we're actually seeing on the poll? So
Sure.
Almost 34% of folks said 90 days. And the next two trailers was at 19% for a year and 18% at 30 days. So to share with you all, thank you for all your voting and your polling. It gives us an idea of where folks are thinking this should be. So Dan, love to have your thoughts on.
Well, a couple of thoughts. By the way, the poll itself is confirming what I've been thinking now for a little while here. The notion of quality of hire, because when you talk to people, I think Chris just nailed it. When you talk at a qualitative level, everyone says, well, quality of hire is most important. There's quality of hire, there's speed of hire, and there's cost of hire. And for years now, I've felt it's pretty clear that companies aren't obsessed with the cost to hire like they used to be. I've hypothesized for years now, and we've seen in talking to customers that at the end of the day, speed of hire is really important. And the reason is that a requisition is created, a job is open because there's a problem that needs to be solved. And having that unfilled creates an ongoing problem. There's opportunity cost to that job being unfilled. And I, as even a CEO of any company, have kind of had the point of view that if my hiring managers don't fill the job, it means that they haven't found someone who's good enough to fill the job. And then if they had filled the job, that they found someone that they can be accountable for doing the job. And so that, as a result, speed of hire and candidates who go through the interview process more quickly, I've had this assumption that there's something about them that means they're a better candidate than someone who goes through the process more slowly. And as a result, at Jobvite, we've been building an algorithm, machine learning algorithm, to begin to predict how fast your position will be filled based on the quality and volume of candidates in the pipeline. Now, when I've been talking to recruiters lately, how are you held accountable? How are you held accountable? They'll always say quality of hire. And I've said, well, okay, how does that measure? Because an era when we have performance management data folding in to a recruiting system seems almost like Buck Rogers. And at the very beginning of Jobvite, we said our job is to put the word hiring back in hiring manager. Where hiring managers are accountable. They shouldn't hire someone they don't think who can do the job. And so when I've been asking a lot lately of recruiters, what really do you think is fair? There's so many variables that predict the quality of a person in a company. Culture of the company, the quality of the hiring manager, the definition of the job, the issues they're facing in the marketplace, so on and so forth. And pretty much everyone has the point of view of, well, the trial period, which in our culture is 90 days. And so I'm not surprised here that the winner by a lot is 90 days. That somehow that seems, number one, fair. If a candidate is a clear disaster within the first 90 days, recruiting has to play a part as well as the hiring manager in accountability on that. The other thing, by the way, being 90 days, it's soon enough that recruiting can actually act on that feedback. Oh, okay, so that candidate didn't work out. Why? For these reasons. All right, well, let's focus on candidates more like this as opposed to that. But if you say that the quality of a candidate 2 years from now is that the recruiting department is responsible, first of all, most companies, I think, hire and fire recruiters so flippantly that the recruiter is probably not even there. But to say that the recruiting department is responsible 2 years into the future on the quality, I'd put the weight on the hiring managers a little bit more responsible. But within 90 days, I think recruiting should be co-responsible for the quality.
Right. We actually had this joke the other day, and I kind of said, yeah, but there were some people that I said do not hire as a recruiter, and completely I was not the primary decision maker, and the folks didn't end up panning out usually. And then, then you're like, okay, let's learn from that. So there's a partnership that comes into play, right, and partnership of both of those voices to be able to assess talent and look for great matches. Yep. And I think even, Chris, you were talking about too, of like, when your speed of trying to hire drags out, that just increases your costs as well, which could be really detrimental to an organization potentially in what they're looking at too.
Right.
Chris, we have a couple of seconds. Chris has a metric around hiring manager batting average, which we are in baseball season. And don't bring up the Dodgers, guys. Key game today.
Right.
I definitely learned to keep track of my CEO sports. And he's like, am I really that moody? I'm like, yes, sometimes, yes. Depending on who's winning and who's losing. Can you talk a little bit about your hiring manager batting average? I know we're talking a lot about kind of recruiters and metrics that are here, but I think this is a good one around the partnership between hiring managers and talent acquisition. Just a couple seconds before we go into our third theme.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the key part, Dan, I thought nailed it when he said, hey, we're trying to put the hiring back into hiring manager. So, the quality of the match is based off of, like a lot of folks, it's not only the recruiter, but it's the hiring manager. So we've got this thing we've done for a couple of our clients, and we're on the agency side, and we typically get pretty deep relationship with clients. So we've pitched something called the hiring manager batting average. And basically what it does, and Dan, I think you'll like it because it encapsulates everything that's at risk and everything that can make a hire go very, very right or very wrong. And basically what we do is we look at the data and we look at all the hires a hiring manager makes. And if the person is still there at the end of the year, we consider that to be a hit. And if somebody's not there after 1 year with the company, we consider it to be a miss. Now, we're very mature about our view of, hey, the hit or the miss can happen for a variety of reasons. So, for example, we could put the exact right candidate with the hiring manager, everybody's in agreement, and the hiring manager's bad at onboarding, and the hiring manager's bad at setting expectations, and the hiring manager really can't manage people. Well, that's a miss. So what happens is you basically just do simple math, and out of all the people that the hiring manager hired, how many are actually there 1 year after the start date? And what you get is a percentage, much like a batting average. And if you do that across 15, 20 hiring managers at your company, however many you have, as long as they have 5 to 10 hires over time, you'll start to see who's really good at it, and you'll start to see who's really bad. And it probably transcends the hiring process and really gets into, hey, who's a good manager, who knows how to onboard, who knows how to set expectations, which, by the way, is one of the things that you have to do in order to leverage the quality hires you do make. So, Rachel, I know we only had a couple minutes, so I'll stop there and let you redirect. But we really believe in it. We've had a couple of clients who have really taken it and ran with it, and it's really changed the type of conversations we have as recruiters with those clients.
Yeah, and I think it's also just the connection from a talent acquisition organization with an HR line organization as well in that handoff of those candidates and the success. And the hiring manager is a constant factor. And so how do both of those parts of HR also connect and be able to identify, wow, we actually really do have a manager who's potentially struggling with onboarding. Wow, maybe this whole group is, or even as a company. And so what are you doing to help with that? It helps you pinpoint, I think, of that. Is data and information to then help identify what are the areas you can improve and go from there. So
I guess just my only reaction to that would be, I think, and I suspect most senior executives or CEOs would believe that at the end of the day, the hiring manager is responsible for the quality of hire, period. And I love your notion of the batting average because I think CEOs would love to see the batting average of different hiring managers. If they saw an entire team with bad batting averages, that I think the CEO would start to question then the human resources or recruiting department. Mm-hmm.
Right.
But if the team has a smattering of players with good batting averages and a few with bad, I think it's the hiring manager's primarily responsibility, not the recruiting department.
So great. So talking about improvement. Our third theme is the coming of automation. What we asked here in this question, which is a little kind of shocking to us when we saw the difference, was that job seekers' automation concerns really are not aligned. Job seekers were saying 69% are feared that their jobs may be automated, whereas recruiters, it was only 10%. And so that was a little shocking. And I think even last year, the recruiter side was actually 24%. So that's actually dropped from last year, which is interesting. It's kind of gone in a direction that we wouldn't have thought that it was going. So I'd love to throw that kind of back out to the two of you, and either one of you feel free to kind of pop in. First is why do we think there's such a gap? Can we go back to the data, because I think it's just great to kind of visually see it. Why do we think there's such a gap here? I mean, this is a huge gap of job seekers versus recruiters thinking about automation.
Well, just Sunday night, 60 Minutes, which is the highest rated news magazine for decades, spent a half hour on automation and robots. And I believe that most citizens, and certainly the working population, has been seeing a lot in the news and in the media about the oncoming automation and how that's going to change the world. I also believe, and so that therefore I think, fear is a big part, a big part of our, what they call the limbic brain, at the stem of our brain is the fight or flight, and it's quickly triggered one way or the other. And I think this is scaring a lot of people, so I'm not surprised at the 69%. Another reason I'm not surprised at the 69% is because, in fact, a big percentage of the working population over the last 20 years has actually experienced it. The kind of job that is available on a car assembly line today at a company like Tesla is very, very different than the kind of job that was available 25 years ago to a high school grad who was joining his father at a union job in Detroit. It requires much more skills. Much of the work has been automated. You have to therefore work with robots in a car. I was in Japan 4 months ago and I got a tour of the Mazda automotive plant. And you just have to see it with your own eyes how clearly the workers nowadays have to be very facile in working with computers while they're on an automotive assembly line. So 69% does not surprise me. Recruiters are dealing with the here and now. They've got jobs that are open now that need to be filled now. And from their point of view, they're overworked and underemployed and underappreciated. So I'm not surprised that they're not saying that all these jobs that they're trying to fill right now will one day be automated out. In some regards, I think this is a sign that we don't leverage recruiting enough in workforce planning. Mm-hmm. If this was a survey of CEOs and their belief about the percentage of jobs that will be automated out, it'll be somewhere in the middle between those two numbers. And the fact is, I think automation in what has traditionally been called the white-collar world or the services world is happening, and is going to happen more slowly on a by-occupation basis. So, for example, a good example is a lot of people when they graduated from college in New York or Los Angeles and they wanted to go into advertising, the first and best job to get out of college was media buying. And it was an entry-level job, and you'd learn the ropes under a team to learn how to buy radio ads and newspaper ads and TV ads. In a world of Google and digital marketing, that job doesn't exist anymore. Mm-hmm. There are algorithms that do the media buying today. And now you have to be a much more sophisticated demand gen person with years of experience. So we've already seen traditional white-collar work be automated out. It's just more gradual than it was in manufacturing.
Mm-hmm. Chris, what's your thoughts on kind of like why you see this gap in the numbers? And do you kind of agree with this perspective that we're seeing from the data?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Dan said. I see that huge number with job seekers because they or someone that was very close to them has already experienced it. I think just like being an advocate for recruiters in the space, I think Dan's exactly right. They're in the here and now. They have a job open, and it requires a person. So automation really isn't their concern. I think one angle I would play on this is that recruiters need to, just from a career perspective, need to be sensitive to the coming automation that is going to impact the recruiting industry and the talent acquisition industry. I think just like Dan mentioned media buying, I think over time we're going to see more and more low-level functions of recruiters that have traditionally been managed by recruiters that are probably more farmers than they are hunters. We're going to see more and more of the recruiter's job chipped away at. I think it'll take time, but if you look 5 years from now, if you look a decade from now, just like Dan mentioned, the media buying, kind of like now the entry-level job is lead generation and marketing. There's a lot of different examples of that in different verticals. But what I would encourage all the recruiters listening on this today when it comes to automation is your awareness is low. This ship is coming for a part of your job as well. And I think the recruiters who are really going to thrive in the next 5 years, the next 10 years, are the ones who can develop relationships in a way that the average recruiter can't and can deliver the highest value candidates to the companies that they work for. And I just think there's a huge gap here when you look at those numbers. Recruiters, and I believe this, just being around a lot of recruiters on a daily basis, recruiters think automation isn't going to apply to them. I would tell you it already has. And just like we see in other industries, it's coming for increasingly higher, higher levels of their job. It's coming. It's going to impact them. It may take a little while longer than it has in manufacturing, but it's coming. And I just see a lack of awareness in that slide.
I think with regard to recruiting, I actually, not only is it coming, I think it's already started to happen in recruiting. In the early days of Jobvite, we in fact had as kind of our mission is a way to automate out all the boring routine stuff in recruiting so that recruiters can focus on the things that they find interesting and that drive their passion in their category, which is talking to people about their career dreams and talking to hiring managers about building teams. And we launched, for example, 3 years ago, this algorithm, machine learning algorithm, essentially a software robot that will help you schedule interviews, look at everyone's calendar, everyone's available time, and it will calculate the most optimum schedule or 3 or 4 or 5 different optimum schedules. Well, in some companies still today, there's a job called scheduler. I don't think the scheduler job is going to exist in recruiting for many more years because of things like what we did with the algorithm, the scheduling algorithm in Jobvite. And I think there's other companies that in video interviewing that are looking at patterns in people's facial expressions as a predictor of whether they are a fit or not a fit for a job, or in their tone of voice or things like that. Well, that stuff, I think the human interpretation of what people say and the human interpretation of what hiring managers want, that's where the meat of matchmaking and recruiting is. I don't see that being automated out. But a lot of the routine, scalable, repeatable work on the scheduling of interviews, the communications with candidates, the reaching out and sharing of information with candidates, we have video screening, which is a way to automate out the phone screen because you're going to ask 5 questions. You don't want a very busy recruiter spending a half hour with someone who after the second question is answered is clearly not a fit. Well, video screening was built in Jobvite to automate the phone screen. But at the end of the day, I don't think the key role that the recruiter plays, which is over years of doing the job, coming up with good judgment and advice to both job seekers on what's the good fit for them and to hiring managers on who is a good fit for them, is going to be automated out. I don't see that in our lifetime.
Yeah, we talk about that consultative strategic component that organization can play.
But the media buying part, for example, of recruiting is going to be automated out just like it is in marketing and sales.
Right. I know one of the things that we really saw, which prompted a lot of the mobile app for Jobvite, was that recruiters, which amazed me that 15 years ago when I started and still even today, a chunk of their time is chasing hiring managers to get feedback, right? And so that was one of the driving forces behind our mobile app, is so that managers could give immediate feedback so we can close the loop with candidates, right? But that recruiters weren't chasing them, right, to go get feedback. And so I think we have a good idea of what's probably starting to go away. I'd love to flip it to the other side of what do you think then as a TA or an HR leader where you've got a team of talent, what are the skills and capabilities that we should start to invest more in for them, for their continued career progression and career growth?
Well, go ahead, Dan. I'm sorry.
I would just say that I think the best analogy would be those professions where automation has changed the game. So in marketing, for example, the marketing people who didn't run away from these new digital technologies in marketing, but instead ran towards it and embraced new technology and tried to be the early masters of it, then became the experts that got the promotions and the career path. And so at a high level, I would just say my advice to anyone in recruiting is to be a thought leader on the new practices, push the limits of what your company can do, and help, for example, in our earlier discussion about building an employment brand. Those who have proven an ability to turn that ship around and build an employment brand are the ones who are going to get the promotions.
Mm-hmm. Great. Chris, love your
thoughts
too.
Yeah, Rachel, what I would say is that, for TA leaders out there, I think what they've got to do, if they look at their team of 5, 10, 20 recruiters, whatever they have, I think, with the coming automation that's already here, to Dan's point, it's going to continue to eat up a higher percentage of that traditional recruiting job. I think the big skill is influence, because, recruiters' ability to influence people like you, Rachel, people like Dan, when they call them up, trying to get them interested in a job, their ability to influence candidates and to influence hiring managers at a really high level, and their ability to close whatever issue is in front of them, I think that's the difference between the farming part of recruiting, which is kind of post and pray, and then dealing with what comes in. All of that's going to be automated. The true hunting portion is all about influence, it's all about negotiation, and it's those skills that already mean recruiters with those skills get paid more today, and in the future, as you see more and more of a recruiter's job eaten up by automation, that's the job that's going to be left. And I think it's similar track to everything Dan described in marketing.
And sales. I completely agree with you. We will, 50 years from now, have very highly paid salespeople who know how to close a deal. But a lot of the marketing part of that happens before a sale is closed will be automated. Right. Same thing in recruiting.
Right. I think the other thing I heard from you guys, maybe not call it explicitly, is the embracing of technology, but data as well. Because if I think about convincing a candidate, you've got a lot of data information about your company that you share with the candidate, but also really using a lot of the metrics and the data that we talked about in kind of the second theme to influence your hiring managers and influence your company about where to invest as you're going to be having particular objectives from a hiring perspective, right? So that correlation of kind of data and technology and that employment brand, that merging of the market, the marketing with the customer, and then that heavy influencing, negotiating skills in that arena to influence all that seems kind of like the combination to think about for the future.
I completely agree. I should have said that. That's exactly right. Data, embracing data is where you start.
Right. So that all comes into play then too. Fantastic. So we have shared our 3 themes. We also do have some time for some Q&A from our audiences. But while our audience, feel free to start popping in your questions in our chat room, and Claire will help us pull out some good ones to be able to take a look at. But anything just top of mind, Dan or Chris, that you'd love to share with our audience that you think was, maybe a key takeaway or an aha you've had the last couple of weeks being out there with customers and colleagues and prospects and stuff like that? Anything, Chris, that you're kind of thinking of? And it's totally okay if it's like, nope, I'm good. We've got
I think I just think people are thinking a lot about how like the whole ecosystem in recruiting kind of plays together. I think one of the things that's interesting, I think people are thinking about the end-to-end like theme of recruiting from the time a job gets opened and sourcing. And, one of the things I saw at HR Tech is I think people are a lot more mindful. I think even people on the provider side have become a lot more mindful in terms of what the future holds and how all these systems that we use are going to have to work together. And I think, TA leaders like naturally think about that. I see folks on the provider side really thinking about that. And I think there's a lot of cooperation across providers that I haven't necessarily seen in the past. I think there's a theme of cooperation because I think there's this theme that data is going to have to flow across all systems, and it's becoming more and more rare for one system in the world of HR to own your whole pocketbook from a standpoint of acquiring talent, managing talent through the entire life cycle of the employee.
Right.
I think the perfect analogy to that point is what Google and Apple and other tech companies have done. It hit them back in 2006 and 2007 that there's a blog, by the way, called Mashable. There was this term in 2007 here in Silicon Valley saying that the emergence of the Mashable web. And the best example of that would be prior to that, everyone built their own mapping technology in their website, and then one day it hit everyone that we should just use Google and integrate with it.
Right.
And so the emergence of cloud applications has made it such that you can imagine an era where you have a base platform, let's say an HRIS system, but then you have different apps for your different business functions that integrate with the HRIS system. Because recruiting is a very different job, profession, and business process than performance management or than learning management. At the same time, to your point, seeing the data from all of those activities and the patterns that take place across all of those activities is crucial to running a business well. So that means then that by definition, any player or any vendor in certainly the HR technology space, but it's the same thing in sales and marketing, it's the same thing in finance. You need to build a platform that is open architecture, open APIs that integrates with all the other applications, because that's what customers are going to demand, that's what they need, that's what they want.
All right, we're seeing our way. We've got some great questions I'd love to field up. Heather asks one about, with the increase in automation, will this decrease human contact with candidates, therefore decrease the candidate experience? Where is there going to be a balance in this one?
I actually think that's already happened, and I hear this a lot from recruiters, that the evolution of the profession has gone from being primarily phone-based to one that is now, email and text-based. And if you
in the sense of the recruiter connecting with the candidate.
Correct.
Yeah.
And by the way, this is common across so many other business professions. Most marketers now know that the era of when a salesperson can actually spend a lot of time with a prospect is over. People do so much research through Google about what they're going to buy, whether it's a lamp or a car or even food now. They do all their research, and they would prefer to buy it online and not ever talk to anyone. Right. It makes me wonder sometimes if we're raising a new generation of somewhat introverts who spend less time in human interaction than they did 20, 30 years ago. Now there's this new tool started by a former colleague of mine at Yahoo called Slack. And I found myself in the early days of Jobvite when I would see people instant message each other and they're sitting like 5 feet away. I would say, you could just lift your head and talk to them. They're sitting right there. And so I think, I don't want to be nostalgic for the past, but at the same time, I think that the richness of interpersonal human communication is so vast that no amount of texting, email content is going to replace it. So I do think that the salespeople, and it's the point you were making earlier, Chris, the salespeople and therefore the recruiters who actually can, in this introverted world of instant messaging, break through and build a relationship with candidates are going to be the ones that most succeed. And the ones that lean back and try to rely only on email and texting and instant messaging are going to fail.
Right.
Yeah, and I'll add.
Go ahead, Chris.
Hey, I was just going to say, Dan, I agree with all of that, and I think that it's funny because the people have the ability to influence face-to-face, and via voice, what I see is that if they can transition those skills to some of the new communication mechanisms that are in play, they tend to win in texting, and they tend to win via Slack, too. It's funny how that works, that the really good communicators who can influence find a way to do it through the other tools as well.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I think the thing I would just add here too, Heather, to your question is that a lot of the candidate experience can actually, when you actually talk to companies who do, map out the candidate experience, the actual touch points that a lot of those candidates are having with the company are not through a human. It literally can be through their own website and how they're projecting the culture at the company. It can be connections that, so the candidate experience isn't always tied exactly to another human touch. It's also all the other media that are out there, all the other messaging you have. And so a lot of the best practices in this camp really talk about map out what you want your candidate experience to be, look at all your different mediums and channels of how people could be knowing this about your brand, and really leverage your existing employees in building that employment brand, and then that candidate experience is tied to it too. So.
I have to make this last comment. I do think if I leave with one theme, is you need to know your market. So, for example, video screening. There are some candidates who would find it very uncomfortable.
Right, and wouldn't even do it.
And therefore, it's probably not the best way to reach out to them. And there are other candidates who would find it offensive that they actually have to drive in or get on the telephone and talk to you in person if it'd be easier for them on their own time and time shifting to just answer the questions.
Right.
So you also have to know your market.
Yeah. So we do have one more question if we're game for. Allison talks about what aspects of recruiting should TA leaders be looking at leveraging robotics and or AI. Chris, any thoughts on kind of that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think, to me, and Dan mentioned that this is already in play, and, going to, being a week off HR Tech, all you have to do is walk around the floor, have some conversations, listen to the content. In a show like that, I think everything below the live interview line is already in play. And whether you're using technology to automate a lot of stuff below the live interview point, that includes sourcing, that includes, media buying, to Dan's point. I think it includes, the ability to screen. So all of those things are in play. I think the thing that hasn't been replaced, although some, pure play video interviewing vendors might beg to differ, I think the only thing that hasn't been at least experimented with from an automation perspective is the live interview with the hiring manager, because there's a connection and there's influence that goes on with that, whether it's a recruiter or the hiring manager. I haven't seen that replaced, and I do agree with what I remember of Dan's earlier comments that I don't know that influence will ever be replaced, but I think everything below that line is already in play, whether you've seen it in your TA practice or not. I think you will in the future. You'll see automation options for all those things. I'll throw it to Dan.
Right.
I was at a conference in Los Angeles 6 months ago, or June or so, called the Recode Conference. It's probably the biggest conference of tech CEOs.
I'm jealous, Dan. I would have loved to have been at that one.
The speakers, the CEO of Google, the CEO of Microsoft, the CEO of IBM all spoke. And while the IBM CEO was speaking, and she was spending a lot of time talking about Watson, a person sitting right next to me looked at my name tag and said, "Oh, Jobvite, I'd like to introduce myself," and he hands me his card. And I was saying, "Shh, I'd like to hear what she has to say." We walk out, and he tells me that he's just invested in a company, he can't tell me what because the deal isn't closed, that is using Watson, the algorithm of Watson, to build a chat bot for the screening of candidates. And he wanted me to both see it and possibly integrate it into Jobvite. And I asked him this question. He's a very enthusiastic, smart investor. And I said, have you ever experienced that kind of robotic-like conversation with the cable company where they ask you to ask a bunch of questions and you're trying to say yes, and sometimes when I'm on my phone I'm saying yes, cable is not working, I need to speak with a person, and you're stuck in that kind of audio text hell. I said, you better be careful that that's not the experience that you launch. Because job candidates who believe that you aren't willing to spend the time to get to know them in person are going to really lash back at that. So it better work. And so my point is just like Chris's, that all the work that leads to the time when you need to actually talk to someone is already being automated greatly. companies now are building talent pools and automating on the marketing side. So I think that's already happening, and it's making recruiting departments much more efficient and scalable as a result. But be careful when we move into this world of human interaction being automated. All I can say is it better work.
I think we'd all agree with that, given all our experiences we've had as consumers in this space, too. I just want to thank all of you. Of course, we can continue the conversation on #JVChat, and we will be getting not only recording but the slides out to all of you. But thank you. Special thanks to Chris and to Dan for your time on this. Fantastic. Thanks for Claire for all of our preparation for this, and thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you on a future webinar with us.
Cool. That was fun. See you, Chris.
All right. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Rachel.
Bye, Chris.